He married her for revenge, but on their wedding night, he discovered a truth that would shatter everything. Alexander Hawthorne, a ruthless billionaire betrayed by the woman he trusted most, has a plan. A marriage not for love, but for humiliation. His new bride, Emily Carter, a quiet maid with no place in his world of power and luxury. To him, she's just a pawn in a twisted game of vengeance. But Emily isn't what she seems. Behind her modest exterior lies a strength and a secret that will shake Alexander's carefully controlled life. As their lives intertwine, betrayal turns to vulnerability, and revenge gives way to something neither of them expected. What happens when the walls of power and pride crumble? When love and trust emerge from a foundation built on lies? Stay tuned, because this story will keep you guessing until the very end. Don't miss a single twist. Let's dive into a tale of betrayal, redemption, and the surprising power of love. The gala glowed with an opulence reserved for Manhattan's most elite. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, their light dancing across polished marble floors. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits murmured in hushed tones, their laughter delicate and rehearsed. Alexander Hawthorne stood amidst it all, the man every eye in the room silently admired. At 38, he was a master of his world, his empire vast, his influence unparalleled. Tonight, he was here to celebrate a victory of the heart, the announcement of his engagement to Victoria Laurent, a woman heralded as the epitome of beauty and grace. But not everything glittered in Alexander's world. From the mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom, he scanned the crowd below with an easy confidence, his glass of champagne untouched in his hand. The golden lights reflected off his sharp features, his chiseled jaw set with a calm authority. His gaze lingered until it landed on her, Victoria, radiant in a red gown that clung to her like liquid fire. The way she moved, the way she smiled, it was intoxicating, but it wasn't directed at him. Alexander's chest tightened as he watched Victoria laugh, leaning into another man, her hand casually brushing his lapel. The man, someone Alexander didn't recognize, was too close, far too close. Victoria's lips curved into a flirtatious smile, one Alexander had once thought was reserved for him. She tilted her head, whispered something into the man's ear, and placed her hand on his chest. Alexander's grip on his champagne glass tightened, his knuckles white. He felt the heat of humiliation creep up his neck, his composed exterior beginning to fracture. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to storm down the stairs, to confront her in front of everyone. But Alexander Hawthorne did not lose control. He turned sharply, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he made his way toward the exit. The valet brought his sleek black car within moments, and as the city lights zipped past the windows, Alexander's mind raced. By the time he reached his penthouse, his anger had solidified into something colder, determination. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light of his sprawling view of Manhattan. Standing at the window, he stared out at the glittering skyline. "This won't end here," he muttered to himself, his voice low and measured. "You want to humiliate me, Victoria? Let's see how you like it when the tables are turned." The idea formed in his mind like the sharp edge of a blade. He wouldn't confront her. That would be too easy, too expected. No, Alexander would play the long game. He'd strike at her where it hurt most, her pride. And he knew exactly how to do it. The following morning, Alexander strode through the lobby of his corporate headquarters, the sharp click of his shoes echoing against the pristine floors. The hum of morning activity surrounded him. Executives greeted him nervously. Employees shuffled past with files clutched to their chests. But he ignored all. His mind was focused on the plan taking shape. He needed someone unexpected, a woman who was everything Victoria wasn't, humble, ordinary, unpolished. Someone whose very presence would make Victoria seethe with envy and disbelief. And then he saw her. She was kneeling by the base of the lobby staircase, scrubbing the edge of the marble with meticulous care. Her uniform, a plain, gray button-down shirt and slacks, hung loosely on her small frame. Strands of dark hair escaped the bun at the nape of her neck, and her face, though plain, held a quiet focus. Perfect, Alexander thought, a cold smirk forming on his lips. "Miss," he called out, his voice cutting through the morning noise. The young woman froze, her hand gripping the rag she'd been using. Slowly, she turned her head, her wide brown eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments before darting away. She stood quickly, brushing her hands against her uniform. "Yes, sir," she stammered, her voice small but steady. "Follow me," Alexander said, already turning toward the private elevators. Emily Carter hesitated, glancing at the other employees who stared at her curiously. She wasn't used to being noticed, much less summoned by the owner of the company. Swallowing hard, she abandoned her cleaning supplies and followed him into the elevator. The silence in the elevator was suffocating. Emily kept her eyes on the floor, unsure of what awaited her. When the elevator doors opened to reveal Alexander's office, a sprawling, luxurious space filled with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, Emily felt entirely out of place. "Sit," Alexander commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Emily obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'll get straight to the point," Alexander began, leaning back in his chair. "I need a wife." Emily blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "Excuse me. It's a contractual arrangement," he explained. 1 year of marriage. In exchange, I'll pay off your debts and provide financial security for you and your family." Her mind reeled. "Why me?" Alexander's gaze bore into hers. "Because you're exactly what I need." Emily left his office in a daze, her thoughts spinning. That night, in her cramped apartment, she stared at the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table. The offer was absurd, but the promise of a better future for her family was too tempting to ignore. The next morning, she stood in Alexander's office once more. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Alexander's smirk returned. "Good. The wedding will be arranged immediately." The Hawthorne estate bustled with activity, the preparations for the wedding moving at a breakneck pace. Emily Carter stood on the sidelines, watching with a mixture of awe and unease as florists, decorators, and caterers transformed the sprawling gardens into a scene straight out of a fairy tale. She couldn't quite believe she was at the center of it all, or that she'd agreed to this at all. "Emily," came a firm voice behind her. She turned to see Alexander standing a few feet away, his sharp suit tailored to perfection. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. "The guests are arriving. You should get ready." Emily's throat tightened as she nodded, her fingers clutching the fabric of her modest white gown. She'd insisted on something simple, unwilling to indulge in the extravagance Alexander had originally planned. It was a small battle she'd won, though it did little to ease her nerves. As she stood in front of the mirror in the small bridal suite, her reflection stared back at her, uncertain, out of place. The gown fit perfectly, but Emily felt like an imposter wearing it. Her life had always been one of hard work and struggle, not glittering chandeliers and lavish ceremonies. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "It's time," said a woman she didn't recognize, likely part of the event staff. Emily took a deep breath and followed her toward the ceremony, her heart pounding with every step. The garden was breathtaking. Rows of pristine white chairs faced an elegant altar adorned with cascading flowers. Guests dressed in designer ensembles whispered to one another as Emily appeared, their eyes scanning her with curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. The whispers were louder than words, and she felt their weight pressing down on her. Alexander stood at the altar, his expression unreadable. As she made her way toward him, she tried to focus on her breathing, on the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, anything to steady herself. When she finally reached him, Alexander extended his hand, his grip firm, but surprisingly steady. "Nervous?" he asked under his breath, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. Emily glanced at him, her voice quiet but pointed. "What do you think?" The ceremony was brief, the vows delivered with the precision of a business deal. Alexander's voice was calm and authoritative, while Emily's wavered slightly, but held a quiet resolve. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was polite applause, though the tension in the air was palpable. As they walked back down the aisle together, Alexander leaned in close, his voice low. "Smile, Emily. They're watching." Emily forced a small smile, though her heart felt heavier with every step. This wasn't a wedding, it was spectacle, and she was the centerpiece. The reception began with all the grandeur one would expect from Alexander Hawthorne. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, and tables were adorned with silk linens and extravagant floral centerpieces. A live orchestra played softly in the background, setting a tone of understated elegance. Emily sat at the head table beside Alexander, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like a fish out of water amidst the sea of high society elites, their sharp gazes and polished smiles making her feel small. "Relax," Alexander murmured, not bothering to look at her. "You're doing fine." "Fine," Emily whispered back, her tone laced with incredulity. "They're staring at me like I'm a zoo exhibit." Alexander allowed himself a small smirk. "Let them. That's the point." Before Emily could respond, a familiar figure approached their table. Victoria Laurent. Her crimson gown hugged her figure perfectly, and her every movement was calculated to command attention. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew they were the center of every room they entered. "Alexander," Victoria purred, her smile as sharp as a blade. "Congratulations." Alexander's expression didn't waver. Victoria's gaze shifted to Emily, her smile turning colder. "And this must be the new Mrs. Hawthorne." "How unexpected." Emily forced herself to meet Victoria's gaze, refusing to let the subtle insult sting. "It's nice to meet you," she said simply, though her voice lacked warmth. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly before she turned back to Alexander. "I must admit, I'm surprised. This isn't your usual type." Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "My choices are my own, Victoria. Surely you understand that." The tension between them was palpable, and Emily felt like an unwelcome third party in their exchange. As Victoria finally walked away, Emily leaned closer to Alexander. "What was that?" "History," Alexander replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for further questions. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Emily did her best to navigate the endless stream of introductions, the shallow pleasantries, the scrutiny from strangers. By the time the final guest left, she was utterly exhausted. As they returned to Alexander's penthouse, Emily couldn't hold back any longer. "Why didn't you warn me about her?" Alexander glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Victoria is irrelevant." "She didn't feel irrelevant," Emily shot back. "She made it very clear she still has a hold over you." Alexander's gaze hardened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "Victoria is in the past. What matters now is how we move forward." Emily wasn't convinced, but she let the subject drop. For now. The days after the wedding were quiet, but far from peaceful. Emily had moved into Alexander's penthouse, a sprawling, modern space with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased Manhattan's skyline. Despite the breathtaking view, she felt out of place, like a guest overstaying her welcome. Alexander, as always, was composed and distant, spending long hours at work or locked away in his study. Emily found solace in the penthouse's small library. It was the one room that felt warm, filled with worn books that hinted at a softer side of Alexander she hadn't seen. One evening, as she sat curled up with a novel, the sound of glass shattering echoed from the study. She hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, Alexander stood by the desk, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. A shattered whiskey glass lay on the floor, the amber liquid pooling around the shards. His usually stoic face was etched with something raw, frustration, perhaps even pain. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked cautiously. Alexander glanced at her, his eyes sharp but weary. "What are you doing in here?" "I heard the noise," she replied, stepping carefully around the broken glass. "You don't look okay." Alexander exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with. Maybe not, Emily said, crossing her arms, but I live here now. If something's wrong, I should know. For a moment, Alexander said nothing, his jaw tightening. Then, as if the weight of the day had finally broken through his defenses, he sat down heavily on the edge of the desk. The board is pressuring me about Victoria. They think my marriage has made me reckless. They don't trust me anymore. Emily was surprised by his honesty. She sat down in the chair across from him, keeping her voice gentle. Why does it matter what they think? You're Alexander Hawthorne. You built this empire. That empire, he said, his voice low, is only as strong as the people who believe in it. Without their trust, it falls apart. Emily studied him, seeing the man behind the flawless exterior for the first time. He wasn't invincible. He carried burdens she couldn't fully understand but could empathize with. You'll prove them wrong, she said quietly. You always do. Alexander looked at her, his expression softening slightly. For the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of something other than calculation in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe. The tension between them began to shift after that night. Though Alexander's demeanor remained reserved, he started to seek Emily out in small ways, asking about her day, lingering longer at the dinner table, even joining her in the library once or twice. Their conversations were tentative, but slowly began to feel less like a transaction and more like a connection. One evening, Alexander invited her to join him for a formal dinner with several business partners. Emily hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? I don't exactly fit in with your crowd. They need to see us together, Alexander said firmly. And besides, you'll do fine. Emily didn't feel fine as she entered the restaurant. The private dining room was filled with power players, CEOs, investors, and executives, all dressed impeccably. Their sharp eyes assessed her the moment she stepped inside, and Emily felt the familiar weight of judgment. Alexander stayed close to her, his presence a small comfort. Throughout the meal, he subtly guided the conversation, deflecting attention away from her when the questions grew too pointed. At one point, an older man leaned toward her, his tone condescending. So, Mrs. Hawthorne, what exactly is your background? Emily's cheeks burned, but she held her ground. I worked in hospitality for a long time, she said evenly. It taught me a lot about hard work and dealing with people. Skills I think are important no matter your position. Alexander smirked slightly, clearly amused by her calm response. Emily has a way of surprising people, he added, his tone carrying a subtle warning. After the dinner, as they walked back to the car, Emily exhaled deeply. That was exhausting. You handled it well, Alexander said. Better than I expected. Was that a compliment? She teased, raising an eyebrow. Don't get used to it, he replied, though there was a faint smile on his lips. Back at the penthouse, Emily found herself smiling too. Despite the challenges, she was beginning to see a side of Alexander that felt human. And though she wouldn't admit it, she was starting to like it. The days that followed brought an uneasy calm. Emily found herself adjusting to life in Alexander's world, though the discomfort of her position remained. She attended meetings, charity events, and high society gatherings at his side, always careful to present the image of a supportive wife. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks in their fragile arrangement began to show. One evening, as Emily prepared for a gala, she overheard a conversation that froze her in place. She had walked past Alexander's study on her way to the library when she heard his voice, low, sharp, and clipped. I told you, this marriage is part of the plan, he said, his tone cold. Victoria's humiliation is all that matters. Emily is convenient. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. The words cut through her like a blade. For weeks, she had started to believe there might be more to their arrangement, that perhaps Alexander saw her as something more than a pawn in his game. But his words confirmed her worst fears. She was nothing but a tool for his revenge. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the wall, trying to make sense of the betrayal she felt. Of course, she had known this was an arrangement, but hearing him dismiss her so easily stung in a way she hadn't expected. She stayed frozen until the muffled sound of footsteps told her Alexander had left the study. That evening at the gala, Emily kept her composure, though her thoughts churned. She played the role of the attentive wife, smiling and nodding as socialites peppered her with questions. Alexander, ever the picture of charm, remained unaware of her inner turmoil. But Emily wasn't the same. Her smiles felt forced, her responses mechanical. By the time the evening ended and they returned to the penthouse, she could no longer hold back. "I heard what you said earlier," she blurted out, her voice shaking. "About me. About this marriage." Alexander stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "In your study," Emily said, her voice rising. "You said I was just part of your plan, that I'm convenient." For a moment, Alexander said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, you knew from the beginning what this was." "I never lied to you." "That doesn't make it hurt any less," she shot back. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to be treated like I don't matter?" Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice softened. "It was never my intention to hurt you." "Then maybe you should think about the consequences of your actions," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Because whether you meant to or not, you did." She walked away before he could respond, retreating to her room. For the first time, Alexander felt the weight of her words. And for the first time, he wondered if his plan for revenge was worth the collateral damage. Emily spent the next few days avoiding Alexander as much as possible, throwing herself into small tasks around the penthouse to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the sting of his words or the confusion of her emotions. Her solitude was interrupted one afternoon when the doorbell rang. Expecting one of Alexander's assistants, Emily opened the door and froze. Standing before her was a man she hadn't seen in years, her uncle, Henry Carter. "Emily," Henry said, his smile too wide to be genuine. "It's been a long time." "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp. Henry stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze sweeping over the luxurious penthouse. "I saw the news," he said. "My little niece, married to a billionaire. Quite the upgrade from the life you left behind." Emily clenched her fists. "Get to the point, Henry." He chuckled, his tone turning cold. "The point is, I know who you really are. And I think it's time we had a conversation about how that little detail could ruin your husband's precious reputation." Emily's blood ran cold. She had worked hard to bury her past, to separate herself from her estranged family and the chaos they'd caused. But Henry's presence threatened to unravel everything she built, everything she'd sacrificed. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Money, of course," Henry said smoothly. "A generous donation to keep my mouth shut. Otherwise, the media might find it very interesting to learn about the real Emily Hawthorne." Before Emily could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the room. "That's enough." Both Emily and Henry turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression icy. "You don't belong here," Alexander said, his tone deadly calm. "And you won't threaten my wife." Henry raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just here to talk." "You've talked enough," Alexander replied. "Now leave, or I'll have security escort you out." Henry shot Emily a knowing look before leaving, and the weight of his threat lingered long after he was gone. "What was that about?" Alexander asked, his gaze fixed on Emily. "It's complicated," she said, her voice wavering. "I'll handle it." "No," Alexander said firmly. "We'll handle it. Together." For the first time, Emily saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Genuine concern. And for the first time, she realized she might not have to face this battle alone. The air in the penthouse was heavy in the days following Henry's visit. Emily couldn't shake the weight of his threats, and though Alexander assured her they would handle it, she couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that her past would soon come crashing into her carefully constructed present. Her fears were realized one crisp morning when Alexander's assistant, Marcus, arrived unannounced with a tabloid in hand. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his tone grim. Alexander took the tabloid, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the headline. Billionaire's Bride, The Dark Secrets of Emily Hawthorne. Below, it was a grainy photo of Emily, years younger, standing outside a rundown house alongside Henry. Emily entered the room just as Alexander set the paper down. Her eyes flickered to the headline, and her stomach dropped. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're already running the story," Marcus said. "It's spreading fast." Alexander dismissed Marcus and turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. "What else is there, Emily? Why aren't you telling me?" Emily hesitated, her voice trembling. "I told you most of it. I left my family years ago. They were difficult. Henry's been in trouble with the law before, and my name got dragged into it because we're related. I had nothing to do with his schemes." Alexander's sharp gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "The media won't care about the truth. They'll twist it however they see fit." "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "This is going to ruin everything." "We get ahead of it," Alexander said, already formulating a plan. "You're not alone in this, Emily. We'll fight it together." The rest of the day was a blur of damage control. Alexander's PR team crafted statements, while his lawyers prepared cease and desist orders for the tabloids. Despite the chaos, Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of gratitude for Alexander's unwavering support. But the scandal took a toll. At a business meeting the following evening, Alexander faced pointed questions from his board members, many of whom openly doubted his decision-making. "Your marriage is a liability," one of them said bluntly. "This scandal is damaging your credibility." Alexander's voice was calm but steely as he replied, "My marriage is my business. If you question my leadership, you're free to walk away." The room fell silent, but the tension lingered. Alexander's empire, once unshakable, was beginning to show cracks. And as the evening wore on, Emily couldn't escape the nagging thought that she was the cause. The fallout from the scandal was relentless. The media hounded Emily at every turn, cameras flashing whenever she left the penthouse. Strangers on social media dissected her life, spreading lies and rumors that only added fuel to the fire. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Emily retreated to the library. She curled up on the couch, clutching a book she had no intention of reading. The walls of the penthouse, once a refuge, now felt like a gilded cage. "Emily," Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his expression weary. "Are you all right?" She let out a bitter laugh. "That's a loaded question." He crossed the room and sat beside her, his presence grounding despite the storm swirling around them. "This will pass," he said quietly. "The media will find a new target soon enough." "It's not just the media," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It's everything. Your board, your reputation, this marriage. It's all falling apart because of me." Alexander frowned. "Don't blame yourself. None of this is your fault." "Isn't it?" she shot back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be dealing with this mess." Alexander reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. "Emily, I've made my choices, and I don't regret them." She searched his face for any hint of insincerity, but found none. For the first time, she felt the weight of his words, not as a calculated move, but as genuine support. It was a fragile moment, but was enough to steady her resolve. The next day, Emily decided she wouldn't hide anymore. With Alexander's help, she gave a brief interview, addressing the rumors and setting the record straight. "I'm not perfect," she told the reporter, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But I'm not ashamed of who I am, and I won't let anyone define me by my past." The interview, though met with mixed reactions, marked a turning point. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Alexander's board remained cautious, but the public began to see Emily in a new light, not as a liability, but as someone willing to stand her ground. As the days passed, Emily and Alexander found themselves leaning on each other more than ever. The battles they faced, both external and internal, were far from over, but they were no longer fighting them alone. The aftermath of Emily's interview lingered like the haze after a storm. Though the media's scrutiny eased slightly, the damage to Alexander's reputation within his inner circle was harder to repair. His board of directors remained skeptical, viewing his marriage as an unnecessary risk. Emily, sensing the strain, began to question her role in his life even more. One evening, Alexander came home late from a board meeting. His usually confident demeanor was frayed at the edges, his tie loosened and his posture heavy as he dropped into the chair across from Emily in the penthouse's sitting room. "They want me to step down," he said flatly. Emily blinked, setting aside the book she'd been pretending to read. "What? They can't do that, can they?" "They can push me out," Alexander admitted, his jaw tightening. "If they lose confidence in my leadership, they can vote to remove me." Emily hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to apologize. None of this is your fault. But it feels like it is," she replied. "If you hadn't married me—" "Stop," Alexander cut her off, his voice firm but not unkind. "I made this decision. I won't let them use you as an excuse for their doubts." Emily's chest tightened. She had seen glimpses of the man beneath the polished facade before, but this moment felt different. He wasn't just protecting her, he was fighting for something bigger. That night, as Alexander retreated to his study, Emily stayed awake, staring out at the city lights. She realized she couldn't remain passive any longer. If she was going to be part of his life, she needed to stand by him, not as a burden, but as a partner. The next morning, Emily sought out an unlikely ally, Marcus, Alexander's assistant. She had seen how closely he worked with Alexander, how he managed the chaos with precision. "I need your help," Emily said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "With what, exactly?" "With the board," Emily replied. "I want to help Alexander, but I don't know how." "You do." Marcus hesitated, clearly taken aback. "Why do you care so much?" "Because he does," Emily said simply. After a long pause, Marcus nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Emily's newfound determination drove her to take a more active role in Alexander's world. With Marcus's guidance, she began learning about the company, its key players, and the challenges Alexander faced. It was overwhelming at times, but she refused to back down. Meanwhile, Alexander noticed the change in her. She asked more questions, showed more interest in his work, and even started attending meetings with him, not as a silent observer, but as someone willing to contribute. It was a subtle shift, but it didn't go unnoticed by those around them. One evening, after a particularly tense board meeting, Alexander and Emily returned to the penthouse. As they sat together in the library, the weight of the day hung heavy in the air. "You surprised me today," Alexander said, breaking the silence. Emily glanced at him. "How so?" "You stood up to Winston," he said, referring to one of the more vocal board members. "Not many people do that." Emily shrugged. He was wrong, and someone needed to say it. Alexander smiled faintly, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usual composure. "You've changed," he said. "So have you," she replied, her tone soft. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. But the peace was short-lived. That night, as Emily went through some old papers in the library, she stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to find, a file tucked away in a drawer. Inside were photos of Victoria and notes detailing her betrayal. Her heart pounded as she realized the depth of Alexander's obsession. The revenge he had spoken about so casually wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was meticulously planned. When Alexander entered the room moments later, she confronted him, holding up the file. "What is this?" Alexander's expression darkened, but he didn't look away. "It's everything I needed to ensure Victoria paid for what she did." Emily's voice shook. "So this marriage, it really was all about her?" "It was," Alexander admitted, his voice low. "But it's not anymore." Emily's chest tightened as she processed his words. The revelation cut deep, but the vulnerability in his voice held her in place. She wasn't sure if she could forgive him yet, but for the first time, she saw the man behind the walls he had built, and he wasn't as unshakable as he seemed. The annual Hawthorne Foundation Gala was Alexander's most significant event of the year, a glittering affair where the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth, secure deals, and bolster reputations. This year, however, the stakes were higher. With his position on the board increasingly unstable and whispers about Emily's past still circulating, Alexander knew this night could make or break his future. For Emily, the pressure was equally intense. Marcus had spent hours coaching her on the guests and key players, but no amount of preparation could quell the anxiety twisting in her stomach as she descended the grand staircase into the ballroom. She wore a sleek, midnight blue gown that Alexander had chosen, a statement piece designed to silence critics and command attention. "Remember," Alexander said, his hand resting lightly on her lower back as they entered the room, "you're not just here for me. You're here as my equal." Emily nodded, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. The ballroom was alive with the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses, but every eye seemed to turn toward them as they stepped inside. "Smile," Alexander murmured, his tone calm and reassuring. The evening unfolded as expected. Endless introductions, polite small talk, and veiled judgments. Emily held her own, though the effort left her exhausted. Alexander, ever the strategist, navigated the room with ease, his charm disarming even the harshest skeptics. But the calm shattered when Victoria Lauron made her entrance. Clad in a scarlet gown that demanded attention, she glided across the room like a queen reclaiming her throne. Her eyes locked on Alexander and Emily, a sharp smile curving her lips. "Alexander," she purred as she approached, ignoring Emily entirely. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," Alexander replied coolly, his expression impassive. Victoria's gaze flicked to Emily, her smile sharpening. "And Emily, my dear, you look lovely. Though I must admit, I didn't expect to see you here after all the rumors." "Quite resilient of you." Emily's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Resilience is a skill I've had to master." Alexander's hand on her back tightened slightly, a silent show of support. But before Emily could respond further, Victoria turned her attention back to him. "Do you really think this charade will last?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "We both know you're better than this." Alexander's calm exterior cracked for a moment, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Careful, Victoria. You're skating on thin ice." The tension was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby guests. Emily, sensing the growing unease, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air. "We appreciate your concern, Victoria, but Alexander and I don't need your approval." The room seemed to hold its breath as Victoria's eyes narrowed. But before she could retort, Alexander gently guided Emily away, his expression a mix of pride and exasperation. "You didn't have to do that," he said once they were out of earshot. "Yes, I did," Emily replied, her voice firm. "I'm tired of letting her walk all over us." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, he realized Emily wasn't just his ally. She was his equal. The confrontation with Victoria lingered in Emily's mind long after the gala ended. Back at the penthouse, she paced the living room, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Alexander watched her from the couch, his tie loosened and his usual composure replaced with quiet contemplation. "You were impressive tonight," he said finally, breaking the silence. Emily paused, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "I just said what needed to be said." "Still," Alexander said, leaning forward, "you handled yourself well. Better than I expected." Emily crossed her arms, unsure how to respond. The distance between them, once vast and insurmountable, had narrowed over the past weeks, but the weight of their arrangement still hung between them. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Why go through all of this just to prove a point to someone like Victoria?" Alexander's gaze sharpened, but he didn't deflect. "Because she took something from me. My pride, my trust. I couldn't let her get away with it." "And what about now?" Emily pressed. "Do you still feel the same way?" Alexander hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "No," he admitted quietly. At some point, it stopped being about her. Emily's breath caught. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but the vulnerability in his voice shook her. "Then what is it about now?" she asked softly. Alexander stood, closing the distance between them. "You," he said simply. Emily's heart raced as his words settled between them. For the first time, she saw the man behind the walls he had built. The man who was willing to fight for her, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. But before she could respond, a knock at the door shattered the moment. Marcus stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said. "Henry Carter is back, and he's not alone." The tension was palpable as Marcus's words hung in the air. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Henry Carter wasn't the type to make idle threats, and the fact that he had returned, and with company, spoke volumes about his intentions. "Who's with him?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus hesitated, glancing at Emily before responding. "A journalist from the Manhattan Eye. It seems Henry's decided to go public with his story." Emily's stomach dropped. Henry had always been unpredictable, but this was a new low, even for him. Alexander's jaw tightened, and he turned to her, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "This ends tonight," he said firmly. "He's not going to control you, or us, any longer." Minutes later, Alexander and Emily were in his private car, heading toward the Midtown Hotel where Henry was reportedly staying. The silence between them was heavy, but Emily could feel the support in Alexander's presence. Despite her fear, a small part of her felt reassured by the fact that she wasn't facing this alone. When they arrived, Henry greeted them with his usual smugness. He lounged in the corner of the hotel suite, a drink in hand, while the journalist sat nearby, a recorder already running. "Emily," Henry drawled, his voice dripping with full warmth. "So nice of you to come." And Alexander was surprised. "You've brought quite the entourage." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "You've crossed a line, Henry." Henry chuckled, unbothered by the tension. "I think you're mistaken. I'm simply here to share my side of the story. Surely the public deserves to know the truth about their beloved Mrs. Hawthorne." Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "You don't care about the truth. You just want to use me for your own gain, like you always have." Henry's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Don't be so dramatic, darling. This is just business." "No," Alexander said, his voice low and steady. "It's desperation, and it ends now." He turned to the journalist, his tone shifting to one of calm authority. "Whatever he's promised you, I can assure you it's not worth your credibility. Henry Carter is a con artist and a liar, and if you publish anything he says, you'll be opening yourself up to a legal nightmare." The journalist hesitated, clearly weighing his options. After a tense moment, he gathered his belongings and left without another word. Henry's smug facade cracked as his lifeline walked out the door. "You think this is over?" he snapped. "You can't control everything, Alexander." "I don't need to," Alexander replied coolly. "But I can protect what matters." As Henry sputtered, Emily finally found her voice. "Stay out my life, Henry. I'm done letting you manipulate me." With that, she turned and walked out, Alexander close behind her. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom, a sense that she had reclaimed a part of herself that Henry had tried to take away. The aftermath of their confrontation with Henry left Emily emotionally drained but strangely lighter. Back at the penthouse, she stood by the window, gazing out at the city below. The familiar weight of fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a tentative sense of hope. Alexander joined her, a glass of whiskey in hand. He didn't speak at first, simply standing beside her in silence. Finally, he broke the quiet. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his tone sincere. Emily glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't feel like it at the time." "You were stronger than you realize," Alexander said. "Henry's a parasite. People like him thrive on fear. You took that away from him." Emily looked away, her mind swirling with thoughts. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "For so long, I thought I needed to keep my head down, to avoid making waves. But tonight I realized, I don't want to live like that anymore. Alexander studied her, his expression thoughtful. What do you want, Emily? The question caught her off guard. She had spent so much time surviving. She had never truly considered what she wanted for herself. But now, as she stood in the warmth of Alexander's unwavering gaze, the answer began to take shape. I want to be more than just a shadow, she said quietly. I want to have a voice, to stand on my own. Alexander nodded, as if her words resonated with something deep within him. Then, that's what you'll do. The days that followed brought a renewed sense of purpose for Emily. She began taking steps to carve out her own identity within Alexander's world, attending meetings and offering insights with a confidence that surprised even herself. Alexander, to his credit, gave her the space and support she needed, never underestimating her potential. Their relationship, once defined by a contract and built on shaky ground, began to evolve into something far more genuine. The walls Alexander had built around himself started to crumble, and Emily, in turn, allowed herself to trust him more deeply. But even as they grew closer, Emily couldn't ignore the lingering fear that their peace was fragile. She knew that Henry wasn't the only obstacle they faced, and that their journey was far from over. The penthouse had grown quieter in the weeks following their confrontation with Henry. The chaos of the scandal had finally begun to subside, leaving behind a space for Alexander and Emily to reflect on everything that had unfolded. However, the quiet didn't equate to peace. Beneath the surface, Emily felt the lingering weight of unresolved questions about their relationship. One evening, as Emily sat at the dining table reviewing notes Marcus had given her about the company, Alexander entered the room with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He set them down gently, taking the seat across from her. You've been working late every night, he observed. It's important, Emily replied, not looking up. If I'm going to stand by you, I need to understand what I'm stepping into. Alexander tilted his head slightly, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. You don't have to prove anything to me, Emily. You already belong here. Emily finally looked at him, her brow furrowed. Do I? Because sometimes I feel like I'm still just the maid who got lucky or unlucky, depending on the day. Alexander leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You're much more than that, and I think you know it. Emily hesitated, the sincerity in his words catching her off guard. I'm trying to believe that, she admitted. But it's hard when I know how this all started. I can't forget why you married me, Alexander. Can you? Alexander's jaw tightened, the tension between them palpable. No, I can't. But I also can't deny what this has become. You've changed things, Emily. You've changed me. The vulnerability in his voice sent a ripple through her. For so long, she had seen Alexander as a man of impenetrable control, someone who manipulated circumstances to his advantage. But now, she saw the cracks in his armor, the man behind the power. I don't know where this is going, she said quietly, but I'm willing to try, if you are. Alexander reached across the table, his hand covering hers. I am. As their relationship began to rebuild, the challenges they faced only grew. The media's interest in Emily had waned, but whispers among Alexander's board members continued to circulate. Some remained skeptical of her place in his life and his company, while others began to see her as a potential asset. One day, during a strategy meeting at the Hawthorne Group headquarters, Emily joined Alexander to present a proposal she had been working on with Marcus. It was a bold plan to restructure a division of the company that had been struggling for years, and Emily felt a rare surge of confidence as she explained her ideas. When she finished, the room fell silent. Winston Blackwell, one of the most vocal skeptics on the board, cleared his throat. Mrs. Hawthorne, while your enthusiasm is admirable, I can't help but wonder if you fully understand the complexities of what you're suggesting. Perhaps it's best to leave these matters to those with more experience. Emily's face flushed, but before she could respond, Alexander spoke, his tone sharp and unyielding. Emily has worked tirelessly on this proposal, and I believe it deserves serious consideration. If you have specific concerns, Winston, I suggest you articulate them clearly rather than dismiss her outright." The room tensed, but Winston said nothing more, and the meeting continued. Afterward, as Alexander and Emily left the building, she turned to him. "You didn't have to defend me like that." "Yes, I did," Alexander replied. "They need to understand that you're not just my wife. You're my partner." Emily smiled faintly, but her confidence was shaken. Despite Alexander's support, she couldn't shake the feeling that she would always be fighting for her place in his world. That evening, as she sat alone in the library, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come and how far she still had to go. The woman who had once scrubbed floors and dreamed of an escape had found herself in a life she never could have imagined. But at what cost? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Alexander's voice. "There you are." She looked up, startled. He stood in the doorway, his expression soft. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping closer. "We've spent so much time reacting to what everyone else thinks. Maybe it's time we decide what we want." Emily tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What are you suggesting?" Alexander held her gaze. "A fresh start. No contracts, no schemes. Just us." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in. Emily felt her heart skip, a mixture of hope and fear blooming within her. "Do you really think we can do that?" "I think we have to," Alexander said, "because I'm done letting the past dictate our future." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like the ground beneath her was steady. And for the first time, she dared to believe that a future with Alexander was possible, not as a deal, but as a choice. The decision to start anew wasn't easy. Alexander and Emily had built their relationship on shaky foundations, a contract, a scheme for revenge, and layers of mistrust. But now, as they stood together in the face of public scrutiny and private challenges, they both knew the only way forward was through honesty and partnership. Their first step was to dismantle the barriers between them, starting with the contract. Alexander, ever the strategist, presented her with the original agreement one evening, the paper neatly folded and placed on the coffee table. "I think it's time we get rid of this," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. It was more than just a document. It was a reminder of how far they'd come. With a deep breath, she picked it up and tore it in half, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "No more contracts," she said softly. "No more contracts," Alexander echoed, his lips curving into a faint smile. Their lives began to shift. Emily, now free from the constraints of their original arrangement, took a more active role in the company, earning the respect of even the most skeptical board members. She worked closely with Marcus to implement her ideas, proving her worth not through Alexander's influence, but through her own determination and insight. Meanwhile, Alexander faced his own battles. Letting go of the anger and bitterness that had driven him for so long was harder than he had expected. Victoria was no longer a shadow over his life, but the scars of her betrayal lingered. It was Emily's quiet strength that pulled him through, reminding him that he didn't have to face his struggles alone. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner on the penthouse balcony, Alexander spoke the words that had been weighing on his mind. "Thank you, Emily, for staying, for believing in me when I didn't deserve it." Emily reached for his hand, her voice steady. "We've both made mistakes, Alexander, but I think we're finally learning how to move past them." Their bond, once fragile, now felt unbreakable. Months later, the Hawthorne Foundation held its most successful gala yet, a celebration of renewal and growth. The ballroom shimmered with elegance, but the atmosphere was different this time. Alexander and Emily stood side by side, not as a power play or a public spectacle, but as true partners. The media had shifted its tone, portraying Emily not as an outsider, but as an integral part of the Hawthorne legacy. Her work within the company had not only impressed Alexander's board, but had also garnered attention from business leaders across the city. As the evening progressed, Alexander took the stage to deliver his speech. He spoke with conviction, his words carrying the weight of a man who had finally found his footing. "I've learned that success isn't just about power or wealth," he said, his gaze briefly meeting Emily's in the crowd. It's about the people who stand by you, even when the foundation beneath you begins to crack. It's about rebuilding stronger than before. The applause was thunderous, but it was the look in Emily's eyes that stayed with him as he stepped off the stage. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the last guests filtered out, Alexander and Emily found themselves alone in the quiet ballroom. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice soft. "So have you," he replied, reaching for her hand. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. Then Alexander spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about the future," he began, "and I wanted to be with you. Not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because I choose you, Emily." Tears welled in her eyes as she smiled. "I choose you too." The moment was simple yet profound, a culmination of everything they had fought for and everything they had become. As they left the ballroom hand in hand, the promise of tomorrow felt brighter than ever before. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, they faced them not as individuals, but as equals, partners in every sense of the word. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this incredible story filled with twists, emotion, and redemption. If you loved it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. Speech Balloon, let us know in the comments. What moment in the story had the biggest impact on you? What did you love most about the characters or the plot? Got a story idea? We'd love to hear your suggestions. Drop your thoughts below about the kind of stories you'd like to see next, whether it's drama, romance, betrayal, or redemption. Your ideas could inspire our next big tale. And don't forget to leave a like to show your support. It helps us bring more amazing stories to life. Thank you for being part of our storytelling journey.